the Bright Horizons Parenting Podcast, just for ages 0 to 8. Get the advice you need from our own early childhood experts, Rachel Robertson and Claire Goss, and make the most out of every chance to teach, play, and love. Grandparents and other extended family members have the remarkable ability to bring joy to a child's life. When grandparents are actively involved in their grandchild's life, they can provide invaluable support to parents and also become a reliable part of a child's family system. Join Rachel and Claire as they explore the advantages of strengthening your family village and discover effective strategies for navigating moments of conflict.
Hi, Claire. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Rachel. We are back again for another episode of Teach, Play, Love. We are going to talk a little bit about how to parent your kids, your own children, with your other family members around, maybe grandparents or aunts or uncles. Mm-hmm. It can be any family member that plays a role in your life. For me, the go-to is always the grandparents. I think a lot of people who are raising young children right now do rely on local family to help them in many different ways, in many different quantities. But I mentioned that to a few of our colleagues this week at Bright Horizons that you and I were going to be talking about grandparents and family and discussing how to parent with these other adults. And people immediately wanted to tell me their stories. Oh, one time this happened with my mother-in-law. One time my dad and I really got into it over this. So this can be tricky sometimes.
Yeah, it can be tricky. It's also, this is a common phenomenon, which is a good thing because that means many, many people have people in their family or their parenting village who are willing to help. Of course, there's challenges, and we're going to talk about that and provide some tips and insights into how to deal with those. But I think a really important thing is this is a good thing in many cases to have family willing to support and help. And grandparents, or it's mostly grandparents, but it could be anyone in the family. Like you said, Claire, they just love that child or your children, and they love you. And, so it's all coming from this good place. We would think it's not so complicated, right? We're all adults, and we all love the children, and we want the best for them. But as we've already alluded to, and people share quickly, it can be very complicated.
Yeah, you really do want the village. I mean, unless you've got a really, really troublesome or toxic or traumatic experience with this other family member, in most cases, you're excited to have this extra person, adult in your life, help you with your child.
And I think that's important to talk about. There are some real benefits, developmental, social, emotional benefits. So having other family members, and we'll say grandparents, but we're going to let our listeners define who those family members are, or those people in your circle, in your village that are kind of playing that role. Hopefully, you have somebody that plays that role for you, but it's good overall. There's data, there's research that tells us that children with a bigger support system like that, it can positively affect their well-being. You can never have too many people that have unconditional love for you, especially as you're in your developing years. It makes a big difference on how you develop, what risks you're willing to take and try, and how you develop your identity and confidence. It's really good for kids. It's good for you to have a support system. It is important. So let's just start with the benefits. So if we keep that in mind, it can feel like maybe less of a hassle sometimes when there's conflict. And this time when you have young children, it's emotional and exciting for everybody, but everybody has a different experience and a different perspective. And when those come together, they'll sometimes crash into each other, right? So yes. It can be, your parents are still parenting you no matter how old you are. I was just talking to you, Claire, about this in a different conversation, is that my dad, my wonderful dad, is still often parenting me. And sometimes after, I'm pretty old. So but it's just hard. It's hard to stop. And I think I'll do that to my children too. My children are older, and I can see myself doing the same thing. So all coming from very reasonable, sensible, loving good intentions place. And I think that's one thing I talk about, or advice I give in a lot of situations, is just assume good intent. Like start with that. Like nobody's coming at this like wanting to have conflict, and nobody's coming at this wanting to be harmful to the child, especially. And everybody just wants to help. So start with that. Distance yourself and just remember that piece if you're dealing with conflict.
Yeah, we actually lived with a set of grandparents. I'm not going to tell which one to protect the listeners, but we lived with a set of grandparents when I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old for like a few months. We were in between, you know, our housing situation, and that was already very, like you said, already a very stressful stage of my parenting. We were moving. First of all, that's stress. And now we're moving into temporary housing, also stress. And then we're moving into temporary housing with a second set of hands, which was amazing, right? I was grateful I had the village, but in a lot of ways, it made my life so much more complicated. And and that's what I hear anecdotally from folks. I heard it this week, which is, I'm so grateful, but they said this and did this, or yeah, it's so great they can come over and babysit, but then why do they do A, B, C, and X, Y, Z? And this is where it gets real sticky, sticky with that village.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, I mean, I should give a shout out to my mother too. While I'm talking about my parents, as I lived with my mom off and on when my children were young, when I was dealing with some transition to single parenting, and I also relied on her heavily as I was growing in my career and traveling a lot. And my kids have such a special relationship with both of my parents, but it was invaluable. It doesn't mean it was easy. It doesn't mean we had exactly the same decisions or choices all the time. I'm sure she had some things she wanted to say to me that she held back on. And, you know, you still have there's a relationship there that's different than a hired babysitter or a early care education or an education program. There's so much history. And then if you're talking about in-laws, then there's a whole different thing going on there. And so you're building on this kind of existing relationship that might have some complexity to it already. And then there's also, you know, you just have some things in that parent-child relationship that you're especially if you're fortunate enough to know that you have unconditional love for a parent, then sometimes you're not as kind, for lack of a better word, or you're like kind of let loose a little bit because you know, they're a sure thing. That's when we just as a kind of a nod to when we talk about teen years, that's something like it's like a hidden compliment when your kids are mean to you because it means they know you're still going to love them no matter what. And the same, you know, that kind of dynamic still exists when we think about grandparents or family members, whatever. So there's some complexity there that's just built in no matter what. But whether, you know, yes, I've heard lots of stories too. I've heard all the way to people like don't want to interact with in-laws or grandparents or family members, or they've kind of cut that off. It can get really significant from just kind of annoyances and frustrations to like really damaging a relationship. So
let's try to prevent that from happening, right? Like if there's anything we can cover today, it's how can we keep this train on the tracks before a relationship might be severely damaged. So I think we'll just kick off by talking about when you feel that like frustration welling up. And actually this advice goes for the grandparents or the parents in this scenario. You feel a frustration welling up. You know, it's kind of like pick your battles. Take a step back and ask yourself, how big a deal is this, right? Maybe it's something like you found out that your mom gave your kid 3 brownies after dinner and you have a policy about no sweets that close to bedtime. Is that a big deal or a little deal? It might feel big to you because you specifically said, please don't do this. And then they did it. But in the grand scheme of your child's life and wellness and health and happiness, it's probably actually really not that big of a deal. Or is it something big? Is it a safety issue? Is it you were driving my kid around town without a seatbelt on, or you let them skip their nap and that actually has real health consequences because now they're going to have a disrupted sleep tonight and that's going to disrupt the nap time tomorrow. And it's a bigger health issue. So just taking that step back and kind of assessing how big a deal is this one?
Yeah, I mean, that's really important. And the extra dessert one, on the surface, it's like, I mean, that's really not a big deal. But often what happens is you've told them, please don't do that. And then they did it. And then you told them again, please don't do that. And then they did it again. And you only
Yes.
found out from your child. So it just sort of builds, right? Is there
Uh-huh.
just that kind of different styles? So that's when that can turn into a bigger deal than it needs to be, but understandably why that happens. And in our kind of, again, I won't out anybody, but in our circle of family that was involved with my kids and nephews and just our family life, we had a time that there was a child, not in their kind of elementary years, was left in a car in a parking lot because that was something that was okay. It was even okay when I was a young babysitter.
Yeah.
And that's very not okay now. And so that, with the best of intentions, right? But that was a big serious conversation that had to be had, and an immediate change of behavior. Whereas the extra dessert is a small thing. So just, it can get so emotional. Some of what we're going to say and what we always say is just step back, take some deep breaths, think about that unconditional love and that support system. So valuable, so consequential. One extra brownie, even though you've said it multiple times, not that consequential. So just kind of try, maybe even have to take a journal or notes to yourself and just kind of remind yourself, because again, there's all this like loaded emotion. That's part of it. And we as parents are trying to assert our control and our values. And then we have our parents kind of interfering in that, or in-laws or whoever it is. And so just, again, I keep saying this, but just getting a little distance around it and making some kind of a reasonable analysis of how big of a deal. I think that's, big deal, little deal, somewhere in the middle is a good assessment.
I think another thing to point out is that kids are actually really smart, and they are pretty flexible, and they know that there are different rules in their life for different settings, right? The same way you're allowed to run around screaming and kicking things on the playground, you're not allowed to do that in the library. They know that there are certain things that you do at home that you do not do at school, and vice versa. They also know that there are some things that fly at grandma and grandpa's house that don't fly at home with mom or dad. So they will pick up on this.
They definitely will. They understand the difference of relationships. They even understand in the same household, right? So if you have two adults in the household, or siblings or whatever, we all adapt without even really thinking about it for the space and place we're in. That's good. That's good cognitive flexibility. We want kids to be able to do that, and they can. And so also, sometimes maybe they've watched more television or a movie at a grandparent's house, and you would say, oh, that's way over screen time, but it's a one-time thing. Again, is that big, little, somewhere in the middle deal? That it's good to think about, because again, kids won't think that all of a sudden the rules are going to change at home just because they got to do something at someone else's house. They might ask. They ask.
They will ask.
That's part of their job, to do that, is to push the boundaries, but that doesn't mean they really expect it.
Did you know that you can get the Teach, Play, Love brand of learning for your preschooler every day? The very people you trust for parenting advice are behind our Bright Horizons preschool program. Learning adventures that inspire kids to reach their unique potential. One-of-a-kind preschool for your one-of-a-kind kid. That's Bright Horizons. Enrollment is happening now. Visit brighthorizons.com to find a center near you.
So I think, we've said this before, but pausing to recognize why this conflict can happen can be really helpful and help you build some empathy. And that, coming into this again with perspective and rationality, and setting some of the emotion aside, and then just empathy for that person's role in your life. So here's the situation. If we're just talking about grandparents or an older generation, is things have changed. So they're not as competent or confident. They know things are changing. Things are changing actually really rapidly, more rapidly. There's more ways to get advice, good and bad advice, than ever before. These folks were your parents in some cases, or somebody's parents in some cases. And so they feel like they did okay. And it's sort of, they have all this lived experience. All of us as parents give each other advice. We have lived experience we want to share with other people. So that's happening. They were in charge of raising young people at one point. So there's a level of, competence. They want to feel like they were good at that. And to be kind of told that they're not, or sort of isolated into a you don't know much, I just want you to follow my rules is hard. That would be hard for anyone. That would be hard in a workplace environment.
Yeah.
It is hard in a workplace.
Yeah.
They love this little person so much. And in many cases, especially if they're your parents, they love you so much. And they don't have a lot of control in the situation. You could take that child away. You could move away. I did that to my parents, and I apologize regularly for that. You can do all sorts of things, and they can't control it. And so this is, having empathy for the situation that they're in is good and helpful. I think when, we talked about the safety issue, the other thing is to be just really kind of figure out what your values are. So you may have different values than those parents or in-laws or whoever we're talking about here in your life. And that's when things really get rough, when they're bumping up against your values. Again, the safety issues, of course, but so really clarifying what those things are so you can talk about them. And so you can set yourself, is this annoying or is this consequential? Is this making a big difference or a little difference? But if it's that value thing, again, acknowledging safety is number one. But if it's bumping up against your values, I think that's where most of the conflict happens. And so like your value might be really healthy eating or no sugar, and then they're violating that value. So then it becomes a bigger deal. And understanding those things and talking about them proactively is going to help quite a bit.
Yes, the proactive, that's like my biggest tip is if you even sense tension happening around a certain area of parenting, just address it as soon as possible, because the longer you let it go, the more resentment's going to build for you. They might be feeling some resentment to you as well. Just air it out, have a conversation, be proactive about that. And I think you've already mentioned this, but just assuming that good intent, Rachel, because it really, I don't know all of your families, but I know enough families to say that they really do just love your kid. They want to love your kid, right? And they're doing it the way that they know best. So the intention is good, even if the execution is not exactly what you want to see.
Yep, exactly. So, I mean, and there's sometimes they're pushovers. I mean, a lot of people say being a grandparent is the best thing because you don't have to deal with some of the behavior issues or some of the bigger challenges. And they like to be the one that does a few extra special things and treats and things. So maybe talk about that proactively where it works for both of you. Like, where can you give a little bit? Where can it be, every time you go to grandma's house, like my grandma had treats in these glass jars on her counter. That was like one of my favorite things to do, to go to her house and have those treats. I didn't expect my mom to buy them. I'm sure I asked for them at home, but that was like a grandma's house thing. So, you want that kind of special moments and some things. And so where can you bend? And it's going to be different for everybody, but maybe you come up with those things together. So you're giving a little bit. They get to do the thing they want. They want to be that special person, and they want to have some special fun things. Like one of my my mother-in-law used to pick up my daughter and take her to story time at a bookstore, and that was just a wonderful thing for them to be able to do together. We figured out a good thing that I wanted for my child, and was special. Only she got to do that with my child, and that was really a successful pairing. And we talked about it ahead of time, so she wasn't doing something I didn't think was a good idea, and I was fine not doing that with my daughter, so it could be their kind of special thing. So that can be really helpful.
I love that idea. And I think when it comes to the tough conversations, if it gets to the point where you're like, I'm picking my battles, but this is a battle I have to fight. This is important to me. It's a safety issue. It's a values issue. Addressing it soon is important, but that actual conversation that you have to have, so many of us, myself included, sometimes not great at those difficult conversations. I'm getting better at them, but the biggest thing is, back to your original point, Rachel, is flex that empathy muscle. Imagine you're going to a colleague at work who's an expert in your field, a coworker, okay? You both, like with Rachel, if I was to come to you and say, listen, I don't think you know anything about child development. I think you're lousy at education. And let me tell you all the things I disagree with. That would not go well for us. That would damage our relationship. There would be some respect lost. There'd be some bad feelings. But if I come to you as a colleague and say, listen, you're an expert too. We're both experts. So that's who the grandparents are in this situation. They are also experts on kids. They did this. They made it all the way through, something you haven't even done yet. Sometimes I think about my parents and I'm like, you did this the whole decades of parenting. I mean, that's exhausting, right? So respect to you. You get respect from me just for having raised me. That was a tough job and you did it. So let's start this from a almost like a colleague perspective. We're in the trenches together. You've been there. I'm in it now. We both love this kid. We're on the same team. And just starting difficult conversations from that angle eases some of that tension right off the bat.
Yeah. It reminds me of a meme I saw that said, "Oh, don't worry, only the first 40 years of parenting are the hardest."
Oh my gosh. It's true.
So they're still parenting. There's parents don't stop parenting because the child is moved out of the house. So I can claim that for sure. But it's just a different kind of relationship, and you don't want to stop parenting either. So you have to find that place that is healthy and successful and positive for everybody. The other thing you can do is find places to ask their advice. So again, using this colleague example, I think that's everyone can relate to that. If a new person comes in and immediately starts telling you how what you're doing does not work and actually is outdated and there's new stuff to know, and I mean, nobody would respond well to that. And that's what it sort of feels like with a whole bunch of other emotional, I don't want to say the word baggage because it's not always baggage, but there's like a whole history there of emotional relationship. So where can you ask this person's advice? Where can you find those places where they do have a sense of control, or what do you think I should do about this? Whether or not you apply it. And same this again, I'm going to say it, we hope some grandparents or family members listen to this too. Do the other way. How would you like me to do this? Be really respectful to those values that your child or the parent of the young children is expressing. So you have this mutual respect and you're finding these places that you can say, okay, this can be your territory. And actually, I'm going to come to you for advice here. And okay, I understand this is your territory and I want to know how I can help you. So a grandparent should say, like, what should I do? What's the role I should play when they're doing something that you don't want them to do, or that is difficult for me to manage? Like, help me make sure that I'm matching your values. And ththese kinds of conversations if you're co-parenting, you definitely need to have these conversations there. So it's the same thing, like a town hall for your village, right? You need to have an actual village doesn't work well if no one's communicating. So this kind of village won't work well either if no one's communicating.
That's right. So I think our best advice is just, again, that reminder that you're all on the same team. You're on team your kid or your grandkid or your niece, nephew, whomever. You're all on that team. You all want the same thing for this child to be loved and supported. So rather than looking at this as an oppositional situation, it's let's get on the same page. Let's remain on the same team. This child is so loved.
Absolutely. And you want, when there's there's other reasons besides the things I said at the beginning, when you have a challenge in your family or the child has a family, you're building their village for them too. They have other people they can rely on. If they're having a tough time with you at home, which will probably happen, they have kind of a safe space to go to if they need, or a safe person to rely on, another adult in their lives. Again, one thing I say to educators is it is imperative that every child have one person at minimum that 100% loves them and believes in them. And it's fantastic if they have more than one. So as an educator, we absolutely have to be that person for every child, but their parents should be that too. Their grandparents should be that too. As many people as you can get, close family, friends, relatives, aunts, uncles, take who you can get that will love this child with you, because that's really important for lifelong health and wellness. We do probably need to say a bit about when it gets really extreme, because there are some situations when, like, sometimes there's a real conflict in values or behaviors, or maybe there's a real conflict in the parent or the relationship you have with your parents that get to a place maybe where a grandparent says something that they believe in front of your children that you adamantly don't believe in. It could be religion, it could be politics, it could be any of these things that get people really heated and in their own corners. And that can be really tricky. And I think, there's a couple ways you can handle this. In the moment, you can have a phrase ready to go, something like that's one way of looking at it, or that's a different view than I have, or something just sort of to confirm in front of your children that you're not just endorsing a belief that, or a way of thinking or acting that is really against the values you've instilled in your children and that you live by. Yeah. You don't have to say anything, but you could in that moment say something sort of neutral like that. And then you can talk about it later without vilifying the person. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about something that you maybe heard Grandpa say today, and let's just talk about that without it being about Grandpa. It's about the thing that they said. Yeah. And so I think that's probably one of the hardest scenarios people are finding themselves in. And again, some people are, okay with a child hearing different points of view. Some people aren't okay with it. So you're going to have to decide where you are on that. But in any tricky situation, it's good to have a couple go-to phrases that sort of, express how you're feeling without creating some sort of conflict.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And if you have that conversation with your child and you're feeling good about it, that's great. But you still may need to go back and touch base with the family member who said the thing so that you can avoid further, again, resentments from building up, anger, stickiness in general. If you do that, if you decide to go back to the grandparent and say, hey, that was really tough moment that we had at dinner the other night when you said this thing and it made me uncomfortable. And, if you decide to have that conversation, just try to do it not with your child present, because they don't need to be picking up on the tension and stress that's that is likely to ensue. It doesn't mean that the relationship is going to be damaged. It might end up being a fine conversation. It might end up being a difficult conversation. Either way, you're going to keep that stress away from your child if possible, because again, from their perspective, these are all just a bunch of adults who really love me and they like spending time with me. Yeah. And that was a weird moment at dinner the other night, but it's okay because everyone is still going to support me and love me no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want children to have to choose between people that love them and that they love. That's a really hard situation, and it's not in any way helpful for children. Being prepared for that is really important, and knowing how you're going to handle it in the moment, and having that honest conversation. Again, using all those things we've been talking about. So one, value the village, whoever's in the village, build the village, do whatever you can do. Grandparents are often a major part of that. And just recognize how valuable and important they can be in a child's life. Have those proactive conversations. Think about your values and where your kind of line in the sand is, or where the hills you're going to die on. Try to think of those ahead of time so you can talk about them. Let this person have a little say, or some special moments, or a little control, or get their advice, engage them in the conversation instead of just telling them. They're different than a babysitter. Don't just give them a list of phone numbers and rules and then engage them. They're part of this child's life in a very loving, meaningful way, and yours too. And then be prepared for when you're going to have, if you have those conflicts, how you can have them head on with that empathy and assume good intent. You could say, can I just talk to you about that, what you said at dinner the other night? I appreciate that this is your point of view, and but for us, those good I statements, for us, this is what it means for us, not about you did this wrong and you said this wrong. So I think that good intent, we're all in this together. We all love this child, and that's a good thing. That'll get you through a lot of this. And hopefully you can have a lot of fun with your network as well. Gives you a little break, and you can enjoy and maybe learn a few things from your parents.
As Rachel and Claire just shared, while some parenting methods have changed throughout the years, open communication and trust can go a long way in fostering warm family relationships. Teaming up with grandparents can bring benefits to the whole family and foster unforgettable memories for everyone. Get parenting advice from Rachel and Claire. You can leave them a voicemail by calling 617-673-8881, and your question may be answered in a future episode of Teach, Play, Love. You can also send them an email at teach.playlove@brighthorizons.com. For more expert guidance on early childhood development, check out our family resources at brighthorizons.com.
Thanks for listening.
Subscribe to us. Find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
See you next time on Teach, Play, Love.
And discover parenting as the joy it was meant to be.